In today's show, we discuss, is the USA already a failed state?
And now, the TNT Talk Show, daring to go where other podcasts fear to tread.
Hello, I'm Tony Fasulo, and I share the stage with my esteemed friend and colleague, Tayo Boya. Tayo, hello, my friend. I hope you are keeping safe and well.
Not really, pal. As you know, I've got various old man issues, but I don't want
you're
to
going
bore
through the mill at the minute, aren't you? Really,
the
bless you.
audience with them. So what I'll just say is, as I usually say, well, the lucky ones die first. So.
Oh, come on. You're not at that point. Come on.
Oh, that makes me unlucky.
Why?
Because the lucky ones die first.
No, they don't. That's
I
not.
See. You're not buying that, are you?
No, I'm not. No, they're not the lucky ones. So, but you seem more upbeat despite your.
It is impossible to be in the sunshine of Tony Fasulo's personality and not feel enthusiasm. It is stomach churning and all that sort of thing, but you can't help it. The optimism is just relentless. It's like being browbeaten by God Himself, into joy. There's nothing you can do about it. Just grin and laugh and go along for the show. So what can you do, man? I've given up fighting it, man. I just got to go with the flow.
Oh, in that case, I'm going to ask you to say hi to our audience.
Hi to our audience. I can say that easily. That doesn't bother me at all. Hi to our audience. Hello, audience. Just for Tony, because he's like that, and I'm in a mood to be generous. Not generous. What's what I'm looking for? I'm not being generous. You're
being nice for a change.
Oh, that's a bit harsh.
Anyway, on with the show. Enough of this shilly-dally. Yes. In today's show, we discuss this topic of whether the USA, even though it's a superpower, is actually already a failed state. So, Tayo, this is a hot button for you, so I'll ask you to kick things off.
Now, what is a failed state?
Do you want me to answer?
Yes, please.
Well, isn't a failed state a country that is struggling to even do the basics, like feed its people, keep them safe, and be able to, ask its army to do stuff, and people will respect it to do what the state asks?
That is fantastic. And on the basis of that, don't you already agree? But, do we need to continue? Isn't it blindingly obvious that America is already a failed state? Because everything you said, can't keep its people safe, can't feed many of its people. And the military and other arms of government are actually out of control. I mean, case in point, the military being out of control. Wouldn't you expect that if a country had spent $2 trillion fighting a war for over 20 years, and then had to ignominiously leave the battlefield, even though that country, having spent $2 trillion and being widely recognized as the supreme military power on the planet, was fighting people with 40-year-old Kalashnikovs? Wouldn't you have thought that somebody somewhere in the military hierarchy would be up for the high jump?
Well, were they actually fighting, or were they just trying to keep the status quo? Because I'm sure if they were fighting, where they're actually in battle, they would. I mean, the example you're giving obviously is Afghanistan.
Yes.
If they were battling in terms of fighting like you would, that we all recognise warlike would be, then they would win. They weren't doing that. They were just there to maintain what was already established in terms of, well, they established it. They try and put a government together and sort of pseudo democracy. But the thing is that they can't have been that bad at achieving that goal, because there's a lot of people now in uproar as to how the Taliban have now taken over. So in achieving their aims in terms of improving what was happening in Afghanistan, I think it's a bit harsh to say that they failed, because yes, they've left rather hastily with their exit plan wasn't that good. And also they'd invested in the people there, hoping that they could just then, like a child, you're holding a child's hand, you help it along, and after a while you let go and you say, go on, off you go. Clearly that child, aka Afghanistan, wasn't ready, and it just fell over, and the Taliban just took over. So yes, they failed, and I agree that the military failed in that respect, but not in so much they were actually at war in Afghanistan. They were just defending the status quo.
Okay, so what happened was this: America went into Afghanistan, thinking they could do something against everybody else's advice, mine included, because Afghanistan is called the graveyard of empires, and found themselves in an unwinnable guerrilla war. There was a time when the body bags were coming back daily. You can cast your mind back. I was living in Nigeria at the time.
Yeah, I remember.
And I used to listen to the BBC, and all these body bags were coming back. And then the American government made the first of many, many laws. Maybe it was the beginning of this era when if we don't like the truth, we pretend that facts don't exist. Because they made a law saying that the television channels couldn't show the bodies, the coffins coming back, which is censorship. And everybody went along with it. We had all these bodies. No, okay. I remember quite clearly this happening. I can't remember who it happened under. I think it was Bush, the second Bush. And it quietened down. Now, what happened was they withdrew from the battlefield and got the Afghans to do the fighting on the ground. And they were offering air support. That was their function, was to offer air support and, in certain cases, some degree of backing up the Afghan soldiers on the battlefield. Which is why, when they withdrew their air support, the Afghan army crumbled, because they had been trained to fight with air support. And that was one of the two reasons why the Taliban were able to so easily overcome the standing army. Other thing that America did, and you'll find this pretty unbelievable, was essentially to pay satraps or warlords, or they call them governors in Afghanistan. They paid the governors to keep things quiet in their regions. Lots of money.
Yeah.
And the governors took the money, sent it to Pakistan, part of it, not everything, sent it to Pakistan for redistribution to guess whom?
Who?
The Taliban. America was paying the Taliban to shut up on the battlefield, essentially through this circuitous route from American to the governors, from the governors to Pakistan, from Pakistan into ISIS, which is their security service, from ISIS into the Taliban. So the Taliban were always essentially a government in waiting. And that is why they sat down in Doha, which I believe is in Doha. They sat down with the Americans. They negotiated this withdrawal with Donald Trump initially. And they said, okay, we won't attack you. You won't attack us. And it was a deal. And Americans, they are deal makers. The money for them talks. So they're like, yeah, okay, we're happy with this. But when it was time for them to withdraw, and then they didn't under the 1st of May deal, then the Taliban started issuing and saying, look, we're not going to keep this status quo forever. And for whatever reason, Biden pulled out the way he did. So when you say they weren't fighting a war, is that they had reached an accommodation that was frankly insane. Because what they were doing is they were paying their enemies large sums of money to not cause a ruckus. And if they could win, they would have won. But Afghanistan is a rocky mountain. It's a mountainous region that is beautifully suited for guerrilla warfare, and you're just not going to win if you're not going to fight an asymmetric war. You can't sit in helicopters and you can't go in with platoons and things, because there'll be nobody to fight when you get there. Then you turn around and then you're hit from all sides, and then they disappear again. Even with your drones and everything, it's not winnable. As guess who found? The Soviet Union. The Soviet Union already found out that you can't beat these guys like that.
Okay. Right? That's. I mean, your points regarding the military side. Okay, they've not succeeded, but then that's not a reason to class the US as a failed state just because of this problem in Afghanistan. No,
it's a failed state because nobody has been held to account for the failure. That's what I'm saying. It's the sort of thing that I would associate with an African nation, that they fought a disastrous war and the generals are still in position, are still in place, and everybody is still, nobody is held to account. It's very much a third world type of situation. In a first world country, you expect inquiries. If that had been Britain, for goodness sakes, we'd have parliamentary inquiries, wouldn't we?
Yes.
People would want to know what the heck is going on, who's responsible.
They are about to, are they not? So it's not, they are looking at the situation as a whole, how coordinated or lack of coordination with the withdrawal and the state and the feedback that they got from the army of Afghanistan, who they set up. I mean, there's questions just about to be had regarding what went wrong there. So there is an inquiry. They will be doing it, but they've done it now that they've left the country. So that's not an indicator of a failed state.
Should I ask where you've heard that? Because I've got to be honest with you, I've not heard anything like that.
I have heard it. I've heard it on ABC News, that they're going to be conducting inquiries about how they left and could they have done things differently. So the exit strategy.
Yes. Sorry. Okay. Now I understand where you're coming from.
Yeah.
That's a slightly different thing. It's that you're talking about is the precipitous way America pulled out of Afghanistan. That's what I'm saying. I'm talking about the war itself, a 20-year war that didn't deliver. That's what I'm saying.
Well, again, that's debatable, surely, because it did deliver, because in those 20 years, there was no direct threats either physically on the US. So whilst they were in Afghanistan, they prevented it becoming a pariah state. They prevented, people like ISIS getting a grip. And so they kept it, in quotes, fairly safe. Because now that it's slipped back into the hands of the Taliban, they are going to struggle to keep ISIS and other groups similar to them from getting a foothold. And it's that foothold that then they use Afghanistan as a base to then attack and influence other places around the world, including the US.
It's interesting that you say that on the same day that the UK Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, said today, and I'm quoting him now, the number of potential terrorists has likely grown in the 20 years since the September 11 attacks, and the terror threat is more global. Now, that is not exactly a sign of a victory in Afghanistan. The people that went in to fight, I mean, it's lovely that you're saying that it's not a defeat. And I'm just going to ask you this, because I'm going to ask you this question. You go in to throw out the Taliban. When you went into Afghanistan, the Taliban were the ruling authority. You went in to remove them from power. You removed them from power, and then you left, and 6 weeks later, they were back in power. And are you calling that a victory or a defeat?
No, I'm not calling it anything. I'm calling it a mismanaged situation. It's not
Why
victory
is it not a defeat, Tony?
Well, I don't feel you have to tag that against the situation. A defeat is if you're fighting a war and you've been beaten and you lick your wounds and you come back and you've got an enormous amount of casualties and you were defeated on the battlefield. That's a defeat. In this instance, they withdrew because they reached their 20-year term. They thought they had enough, didn't want to spend any more money there, and decided to leave. Now, I grant you, I'm not saying it wasn't a messy withdrawal, because they didn't really consult their allies like us, the UK. We were the main allies to the US in Afghanistan, but they hurriedly pulled out without getting our viewpoint or listening to our viewpoint at all. And we had warned them to say that this vacuum being left, they could jump in, which exactly what happened. And the Taliban just came in again. So, for them choosing to leave, they weren't pushed out, they did choose to leave. And that's the difference between saying a victory and a defeat. You don't really need those terms in this. It was a choice to leave.
So I think if I have to give you the benefit of the doubt, you wouldn't call it a defeat because they weren't forced out. That's what you're saying. But you would then have to agree with me that it's a failure because they didn't succeed.
Oh, I agree. I'm not saying it was a success by any means. It was a partial success while they were there, but they've undermined all the previous work that they did by pulling out in such a shoddy, disorganized manner, really. They didn't do it with the sensitivity it deserved and to ensure that the people they left behind were able to continue in a manner that should continue. Because if it was such a bad situation, you wouldn't be having all these riots that they're having now, these demonstrations, which is unheard of in Afghanistan against the Taliban, because the people there were happy with how things were panning out. They were happy with the freedom that the Americans had given them. They were happy with the way that the country was actually thriving compared to before. They had jobs, they had careers, they had food on their plate. They weren't in the dire straits they were previously. So that's why it hasn't been a total failure. The exit strategy wasn't great, but the country wasn't in such a bad place. Unfortunately, there were still some key pillars that weren't put in place and left strong enough. And as we've already seen, it just fell and crumbled, and the Taliban just stepped right in.
Okay, so my position is that if you go in to remove people, a party or the philosophy, or I don't know what you want to call the Taliban, you go into a country to remove the Taliban, and 20 years later when you leave, the Taliban is still there. Essentially, you haven't achieved anything. Now, if when you leave, people say, oh, the Americans were great, and these guys aren't, and they're rioting, all it proves is that you didn't defeat the Taliban. That's all that it proves. That you were in there, you showed them, the Afghans, a different way of living, which they liked, but because of your failure to defeat the Taliban, you've handed them back into the arms or the clutches of the same Taliban. It's 20 years later, nothing has changed. The ruling authority in Kabul and in much, if not all, of Afghanistan are the same people the Americans went in there to throw out. And that's just the fact of life. And my point is this. Given that the Americans failed in Afghanistan, essentially, I mean, when at final analysis they failed, who is for the high jump? Somebody somewhere ought to be responsible for the dismal failure of a 20-year policy and $2 trillion gone down the tubes. Who is it? Well, now, in a first world country, I would expect in a first world country, I would expect that to be due process, steady, calm, reasoned process. People would be put on, sworn in under oath. They'd have to give evidence. Hopefully, objective people would judge the situation and then would say, well, really, this is the person, or these are the people who are to blame. And then I'd expect resignations and sincere apologies and things like that, groveling apologies. And that is what I expect from a first world country.
Well, what I expect
from a third world country is what I'm seeing in that a colonel I believe it was the Air Force, was saying, just for the sake of the American fallen in Afghanistan, just for the sake of the thousands of civilian deaths, that he would expect his superiors in the military to step up to the plate, to take responsibility. And he said he hasn't seen that and he's disgusted. And he was fired. 3 years to his pension, I understand, and he was fired. And he ended up saying on YouTube he didn't care about that. That he still says that it's a disgrace and it's a failure. It's a disgrace. I think he put it like it's a disgrace to the uniform and a failure to I think it was a Marine, not an Air Force officer. It's a failure to the Corps or something of the esprit de corps. That there isn't that instinct to stand up and to be responsible. To say
maybe there, we don't know, but maybe some of the military leaders wanted to fall on their sword. However, they were told, not yet, let's do a proper analysis of what went wrong. what could have been done better, and decide from there. Because if someone falls on their sword immediately, taking the blame, and they're not fully responsible, then they've been premature. In a proper first world country, you would expect none of that to hastily happen. But instead, what you've just said is correct. They would then do the proper analysis to check what went wrong, how they could have done it better, and so forth.
I think you just invented that, didn't you?
No,
have you got any evidence to support your position there?
They are doing inquiries. I want to move away from this Afghanistan element because it's still very early days. So we're covering it before even the dust has fully settled. Also, I want to take you up on a point, if I may.
Before you do, I can give you some information.
Oh,
it was in the Marines. The chap was in the Marines. He was a lieutenant colonel. His name is Stuart Scheller, Scheller. And he was speaking to the Washington Post. He said, the baby boomers' turn is over. I demand accountability at all levels. If we don't get it, I'm bringing it. Because I don't know where you're getting their thing that they were going to do an inquiry. I've not heard.
Well, they were. Like this is what I'm hearing. I was hearing that they are going to analyze what's happening and what occurred and how it could have been done better. And if heads then have to roll, then heads have to roll. Someone has to be accountable. Someone has to take the blame. So that may still happen where the dust hasn't fully settled. And I want to go back to that point. You said the Taliban is the same Taliban that's come in. It isn't the same Taliban. 20 years have passed. They're a different Taliban. They're saying whether okay, we don't know. This is obviously digressing slightly. They have said they are more understanding and more liberal. They're going to let women do stuff. I know. But I'm one of these people, show me, don't just blow in the wind. Words count for nothing. We want to see your actions. Okay, so Tony, they have said that. We'll see what happens. But anyway, let's bring back on point now.
Yeah, yes, we can. And I'm going to let you do that. I'm just going to finish what I wanted to finish this off. Back to Scheller, because this is my final statement. Don't worry. Mm-hmm. Back to this Lieutenant Colonel Scheller. He's a 17-year Marine, 3 years short of his full pension, as I said. He specifically called out Marine Corps Commandant General David H. Berger, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley. He said, people are upset because their senior leaders let them down, and none of them are raising their hands and accepting accountability or saying, we messed this up. And that's his position. And as a 17-year Marine, I think he knows what he's talking about. And that's where I end that.
Now, describing whether a country is a failed state isn't just militarily. You've obviously got to look at home. You've got to look at
healthcare, for instance.
Yeah, healthcare, absolutely. And whether the people are looked after on the street, whether there's the socio-economic indicators, healthcare, inequality, standard of living. These are all things that education. These are things that a country's gauged on. And the US have got the biggest economy still, above all else, although China is rapidly catching up. And based on this, you have to then look at, with these indicators of all these key areas in society, are they performing like they should be? They should be at the top of the tree in all of them, based on the economics of the country, because they are by far the wealthiest.
Well, let me give some details.
Go on.
For the US healthcare. And this is from a online magazine called The Hill, thehill.com, and discussing the state of the parlous state of the US. In fact, the article is titled, US Healthcare is an Ongoing Miserable Failure. And here
even though it's private.
Even though it's private. US life expectancy has fallen for the last 3 years. This is 2021. So for the last 3 years, the article has been published, 2020. I beg your pardon, I take that back. 2019, I'm sorry.
Okay.
It says for the past 3 years, in 2019, U.S. life expectancy has fallen whilst it rises around the world. U.S. infant mortality is 5.6 per thousand live births, but only 3.6 on average in the EU.
Wow.
American maternal mortality is 14 per 100,000 births. Compare that with three deaths per 100,000 births in Finland, Greece, and Poland. US healthcare costs 18% of GDP, whilst it is limited to barely 9% of GDP in Europe.
Wow.
Exactly. Wow. I know, but finally, the US life expectancy is 78 years compared to 81 in 28 countries of the European Union. I think in 2019, were we still in the EU? I think we were, aren't we? So that's why it says 28 countries of the EU.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now I would say that with all the money, 18% of GDP, and their GDP is huge, right? And 18% of their GDP is producing figures that puts them, in another article I read, 34th in the world in terms of healthcare. Now that's
ridiculous. How?
Exactly, because it's snouts in the trough. It's like the same thing. You go and drop, spend 2 trillion in Afghanistan. That money is going to the military-industrial complex. In this instance, it's going to these healthcare insurance companies and medical practitioners. It's apparently, my nephew lives in the US, and he says you don't let kids play, go outside to play, because if a kid falls out of a tree and breaks his arm, you're looking at $5,000 right there and there. So it's not a question of keep the kids in because there's dangerous. It's keep the kids in because we can't afford it. So they can't afford it if the child gets hurt outside. And it's this thing about paying all this money where it's going into middle people. It's going between the healthcare provider and the patient. There are all these middle people who want money. That's how they earn their living, and they're not truly part of that relationship, are they? They're middlemen and women. Let's be fair. And so, what are you paying them for? What are you paying all these people for? You're paying them because that's the system.
See,
even here in the UK, a lot of people, myself included, I really hate all these NHS managers. It's like truly in a GP surgery, general practice, for those audience members who don't know how the British system works. I think Tony is always better at explaining things like this. Can we just give a very brief overview of how the NHS works?
In the UK,
GPs, what is a GP? That's probably what people want to know if they don't know the British system.
In the UK, the GPs are basically our doctors, our local doctors, and the national health system is funded by everybody in the UK, so it's free to any citizen of the UK. And basically, you can book an appointment to see your local doctor, and they will tend to you, and it's free. It's part of the fact that you're paying for it all through taxes. And the beauty of that is that you can book and see a doctor when you need them. Now, obviously, they will cover a lot of things for you to ensure you're okay. So if you need a hospital visit because you are sick or there's a problem, they will look after you and ensure you get that treatment. They won't look after you for cosmetic changes. Obviously, those are things that you would have to then pay for yourself. But if you're sick and there's something wrong with you, you can see your doctor, and your doctor in the UK will care for you without any additional cost to you.
Excellent.
Now, the difference, there is a private service available, because obviously, as you can imagine, when you see you've got this whole system which is free, there is some waiting times. So you go and see your doctor. You can see your doctor. It wouldn't be the same day, but within a few days you will see them. If you then need treatment, if it's not life-threatening, then you would have to wait. But the treatment would eventually, once you're seen, be free. So, the consequence is that it isn't quick. But that aside, it's still available for every single adult and child who is a British citizen in the UK.
Okay, so let me correct two things. If it is life-threatening, you call 999.
Yes.
Or 111, and you'll be seen very quickly.
Yes.
And you'd be taken to the hospital and you'd be treated very quickly.
Yes.
So when I had COVID, I didn't need to wait to see my GP.
No.
I was treated as an emergency and taken to ICU.
Yeah.
The second thing you said about plastic surgery, yes, if it's a question of just your ego, then you may have to pay for it yourself.
No, you will have to
However,
pay.
if it is affecting you mentally, then it is treated as a disease. As they will do, you will be paid. The state will pay. If you are having, if you're clinically diagnosed as being depressed or suffering mental health issues because of something in the way you look, I'm not talking about you don't like your chin. I'm talking about some kind of scarring or something that's egregious, maybe a cleft lip or something, which is obviously not pleasant. Then that will be treated on the NHS.
Yeah.
Yes. So the thing I wanted to say is that these the surgeries, which is the buildings or the businesses or the clinics, that's the word, clinics where you see your GP, your general practitioner, your personal doctor.
Yeah.
Those clinics are run in such a way that they might need a manager because doctors are not managers.
No.
Right.
They do have an office manager. Yes,
they do have an office manager.
Yeah.
Now, no one is going to be upset that they need an office manager to do management and do administration and people, secretaries and receptionists and so on and so forth. Nobody cares about that. What we care about is that the NHS itself seems to have a lot of middlemen in the system who are managing all sorts of things, and they're not doing it particularly well, and they're making a lot of money. And in that sense, it is somewhat similar to the middlemen in America. That's the point I was trying to make.
Right.
So that's the beef that we have with our system here. But it's nowhere near, because it's all, public money, public funds, it's still controlled here. But in America, it's not controlled. And I was listening to a chap called Noam Chomsky, is that his name? He's a very famous fellow. Do you know him?
No, I don't actually.
Noam Chomsky, I believe. A lot of people be laughing at me now because he's so famous. They'll wonder how I've messed up his name. And
I didn't even know him, so there you go.
Well, he was saying that, he was saying this in 2020. I mean, the man is 94 years old now. He was saying in 1920 that he remembers listening to Ronald Reagan's speech saying the problem with America was its size of its government, and that Ronald Reagan was going to make the government smaller. And he said people were clapping, and applauding, and he was looking and thinking, what is the matter with these people? Reagan has just said, we're going to take decision-making out of the hands of people who are accountable to you, the public, and put it in the hands of people who aren't. And now he says 40 years later, the chickens have come home to roost. And that is exactly what we see. We see that there's very little accountability because it's all in the private sector. So that was, what did people think was going to happen? And that is another reason I'm saying that America is already a failed state. Now, I'm still going to give some more examples of why America is a failed state. But so far, I've said the military. Yeah. I don't think they've really won a war, unless maybe you want to say the Gulf War. But discounting the question of the first Gulf War, a lot of military analysts would claim that America hasn't won a war since the Second World War. Now, be that as it may, there's a military which spends a lot of money, $970 billion at last count.
A year.
Like I said, ignominiously left Afghanistan. Really haven't defeated ISIS in either Syria or Iraq. They've just curtailed them, much like they did with the Taliban. They suppressed them, but the cancer, if you like, is still there. My goodness, I lost my train of thought. What was I going to say? I was really headed somewhere.
You were saying about the Ronald Reagan when he first he said that the government was shrinking, so that they were accountable originally, and now they weren't. And so it was going into the hands of these middlemen who aren't accountable.
Yes, the private sector, essentially, the people who aren't accountable. But how does that tie into the failure of the state? Aha! Right. So,
aha moment. Yeah, go on.
Yes, aha moment. So imagine this. This is a metaphor I want to give you. You're driving a car and the brakes fail and you're speeding at 70 miles an hour and your brakes fail. You're still on the motorway, you haven't crashed, but your brakes have failed. So when I say America is a failed state, that is the exact state that I'm talking about. Its brakes have failed and it is careening down the motorway. So what we're waiting for now is the crash. So I don't want the audience to think, well, Tayo is wrong because, America is still a corporate entity. It's like, no, all the markers of a failed state are there. It's just that the final impact hasn't yet occurred. The other thing I want to talk about, which is related to the military, but it is more a failure in psychology, is what is going on, which is very, very worrying, what is going on between America and China over Taiwan and the Taiwan Straits.
This is not something for a failed state, though, is it?
It is. Because it's a failure in the heart of government in America. And for you to understand, not just you, Tony, but for the audience to understand, you really have to understand where I'm coming from on this. Kamala Harris, the Vice President of America, recently went on a trip to Southeast Asia. One of the countries she visited was Vietnam. Believe it or not, and a lot of people won't believe this, believe it or not, the slogan of that trip was, America is back. Can you imagine going to Vietnam with the slogan, America is back? You vice president? There's a State Department, which is their equivalent, the American equivalent of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that we have here in the UK. A lot of British colonies have ministries rather than departments. And you think that here we have a Foreign Affairs. Can you imagine Foreign Office? Thank you, Foreign Office. Can you imagine the Foreign Office letting we don't have a deputy prime minister or
foreign secretary.
Can we letting our foreign secretary go somewhere to, let's say, Hong Kong and say Britain is back? It's mind-boggling. It just wouldn't happen.
I mean, Hong Kong's not a good example because
we left Hong Kong, and the Chinese don't want us to come back there, and then we go back to Hong Kong, and then we say Britain is back. What does that mean?
Well,
the Vietnamese kicked out the Americans.
Yeah, that's different because that was actually a war. So they were there.
It's even worse in that case, isn't it? It's even worse.
Yeah, it's worse. It is worse for Vietnam to use that terminology.
That is a failure at the heart of government, is Tayo's point.
Yeah.
That is the heart of government. That somebody somewhere in State Department should have said, hang on a minute, that can't happen. Some senior official somewhere must have said, no, you can't go to Vietnam and say America is back. And of course, when she got there, she was given very short shrift. Why wouldn't she? Why wouldn't she be? It was so insensitive. That same insensitivity is what is worrying me about China and America and Taiwan. That insensitivity, that lack of self-awareness, that astonishing lack of self-awareness is edging us all closer to war.
Funny you should say that. Sorry to interject. I'm actually going to agree with you because there are some people who I follow on Facebook and other social media channels. And when China and the US were having this trade war, a few people, and this shows how, I've got to say this, those individuals, I won't name them, but they were very, very ignorant when they said, let's go into China and show them some democracy. I was taken aback by the gall of the post, and I thought, I didn't want to get involved or stir up the fuel, but did he even understand what he was saying? Understanding that China is a superpower with nukes and armies, and it begged belief, the arrogance of that statement. But that then, to me, I know you want to talk about the South China Sea, not South China Sea. Yes, you do, and Taiwan and all this.
Taiwan Straits, yes.
I want to then hold that thought, or pin it for now, with the education system, because that is one of the pillars. But go on, carry on with your story first.
And as you say, I'll take your lead on that, because as you're saying, you have to wonder what it is that people in America are missing. How could you say something like that? What do you think is going to happen? How are you going to just sort of mosey into China and land somewhere and just teach them democracy. How on earth are you going to manage that? Do they even understand the Chinese system? Somebody was given a speech, I don't know his name, he's a Chinese official, very senior official, was addressing an international conference. There was a Nigerian chap there who asked a question, which is why I know about it, because he asked how China was able to turn itself around and achieve what it's achieving now, have the CCP in particular, the Chinese Communist Party. And the chap said, well, in our civilization, which has been in place now for 1,500 to 2,000 years, in our civilization, using Confucius's theories, our civil service has always been a meritocracy, even when it was corrupt. And the meritocracy comes like this. You sit exams. Based on the exams, you're given a position in the civil service, and then they watch you and they see your efficiencies and your successes. And then based on that, you are selected to stand for election. So he said, our system is selection election. You can't have a Donald Trump just come out of nowhere and say, I want to be the president.
No.
It can't happen because nobody cares. Nobody knows who you are. You haven't done anything. Xi Jinping has got, when he became president, had 30-something to 40 years of experience and history behind him. And when he was competing for office of president, he was competing against people who had other long terms. And looking at his record, a lot of people were able to say, this is the person we want. Do you understand? That's their system.
Yeah, that's true. The meritocracy is actually a good idea because you're only in that position because of merit of your qualifications, your background, etc. The problem with the Chinese system, even though that element of it has value, you're not giving the people the choice as to who will govern you out of a pool of some really good candidates. They are being discussed and decided by a small select few.
But everybody who selects got there on merit is the idea.
I respect it. It's an interesting and a very good system, but
you can't get a demagogue.
Well, I'm not so sure about that because now she is extending his stay. He's not like he's got a term.
Thank you. Yes. Now, you were saying something, and well, I was headed somewhere. Then
you were talking about the South China Sea and Taiwan.
Now, this chap that I listen to, like you listen to people on Facebook. I follow a podcaster, and he said something, and it's axiomatic. He said, so there are two axioms in international geopolitics. Don't march on Moscow. And if that's a military axiom, everybody who has ever marched on Moscow historically, from the Poles to the Swiss to the Turks to the British where they landed in Crimea. I don't think they ever even got on the road to Moscow when they landed in Crimea. To the French with Napoleon, to the Germans under Hitler. Is that everyone who's ever tried to get into Moscow has always been defeated, mostly because of the Russian winter. So he says it's a military axiom: don't march on Moscow. He said then in the diplomatic world, there's another axiom which is don't think China is bluffing. The Chinese don't bluff. It's just part of their culture. There's no bluffing there. When they say they will go to war over Taiwan, they mean they will go to war over Taiwan. And what I'm saying is that the failed state of America doesn't realize this, that the same blind lack of self-awareness that we saw with Kamala Harris going into Vietnam saying America is back is the same blind lack of self-awareness, lack of situational awareness that is going to land us all into hot water when the Americans try to support the Taiwanese, that we will end up fighting a hot war. Hopefully it won't go global, but I must point out that Russia, to maybe our audience will know this, Russia and China are basically now an alliance. They just held in 2021, finished in July, They've just held joint exercises in which each other's military were allowed to go on to join and use the other's military equipment. And they were under the supreme leadership, that particular exercise under a joint leadership, but the overall supreme leader was a Russian. So they are working very closely hand in hand. Anybody who attacks China is essentially going to be attacking Russia as well.
Okay, that's a sorry situation, but we're digressing a little.
No, I'm saying, do you think that it's a failed state? That if they weren't a failed state, Henry Kissinger, he would have looked at this situation. Madeleine Albright, these people would have looked at the situation and they would have understood what was going on. The present crop of failures don't understand what's going on. You have the American, it's not foreign office, it's not foreign secretary.
No, it's the vice president.
No, Secretary of State.
Oh,
Secretary of State, the American Secretary of State, I forget his name now. He was humiliated by the Chinese in Alaska when they held their conference in Alaska. He went there to lecture them. And for the first time, this is when the Chinese started showing that they're fed up. Because they'd always been polite before, always, even when Trump was in office. But for the first time, they let the Secretary of State finish speaking. Then they turned around and said, "You are in no position to lecture us." And they gave every single reason of why America is a hypocrite to his face.
But the thing is, they are. I'm agreeing with you.
Which had never happened before.
Yeah.
So something has changed. Something in their mindset of the Chinese has changed. They're not backing down.
They're not being bullied.
They're not being bullied.
Yeah.
They've had enough now. But do the Americans know that? They don't get it. It's a failed state.
The other element is, you see, for me, I have to agree on some pointers here. Where the problem in America is that the 1% are the richest people on the planet, bar none. And that's what's happened. Even though America has all this wealth, you would have thought that, most people will be living in mansions and affording their own Learjet.
Not really.
No, but if you think about it, because the population in relation to the income that they generate, they should all be having an incredibly high standard of living. Their education system, they should be all having the best teachers with the best educators. And you should have, although there's a 1% across every nation where you've got some elite kids. But in relation to the size of the population, they're not producing enough real super talent. And the big corporations are sweeping up those few for themselves, but that's all it is. The rest are just left to find their own way. And that's, for a country that's so wealthy, why do so many people live in relative poverty? For a country that well off, there should be nobody. The social system should be picking up the pieces for the people at the bottom and still have enough funds to let everybody still be very, very comfortable without fear, worry, or, pain of taxes. But instead, everybody is struggling to find their way. And there is a lot of people who are on the poverty line and below it, and they don't have any safety net. And they firmly believe that everybody should make their own way, which is fine. And that's a great, admirable trait. But you still should help the people most vulnerable in society.
Absolutely.
And they seem to not have this. For a country so well off, there are many examples of countries less able than the US, but have far, far better systems. The pillars that underpin the country are far stronger elsewhere. The US seems to have its pillars disjointed, where you've got a lot of funding on one pillar, which is the military, hugely. The healthcare pillar has been left to crumble. The education one the same. The investment isn't really there. They leave it for the individuals to pay for their education. So, how are you getting investment from the federal government? You don't, because it's not used there. Instead, they feel that they should fund corporations for them to give people jobs. But because their laws for their workers aren't that tight, the corporations are there just to use the people and their workers as not slave labor, but
serfs.
Yeah, exactly. And so the money all goes to the corporations and all the big institutions and the 1%, whereas the rest of the middle classes is shrinking, and the bottom rungs of people, the lower classes effectively, is growing to silly amounts because they're just struggling to live, make ends meet, and living off charity as best they can. That's not a state that is something to be admired. That's not a situation that you can, be what's the word? You can stand up and puff your chest out and say, look how we live as the US. But they're quite comfortable with preaching democracy to everybody else, but they really need to get their house in order, stop this polarization of the population, which has been going on for a number of years. And why does everybody believe everything that's said in the media? What is that all about?
Maybe it has to do with the fact that in the American population, which for the American population of those aged between 25 and 34, with post-secondary credentials, America has about 41%. 41%, that's less than half, have got post-secondary credentials. And you can compare that with world champion South Korea, which is at 63%.
Wow.
And 56% for Canada, which of course has a border with ironically has a border with America. So 56% of Canadian are tied with, in second place, with 56% of Japanese. Russia being fourth at 55%. Now, I'd be interested to know where the UK comes in this. I'm hoping we're above half, but that is one of the indicators that America isn't doing very well when it comes to education. The other reason it's not doing very well is that it doesn't actually fund its public schools very well, because again, that same basic mindset of if you can't pay for it, you get what you deserve. You deserve what you get. That same basic mindset seems to be at play. And so if anybody ever goes online and says, what are the failures of American education, they talk about crumbling infrastructure, deficit in funding for schools, the way that technology is they try to interweave technology into education. And I don't know why they're having issues with that. I'm going to have to read up on it. So I can't say more than that. And the core curricula is a political football that goes between the Marxists and the conservatives, if you like, the neoliberals and the conservatives. The people who end up suffering are the poor students, as everyone says. But that in a sense is also happening in the UK, where students are being taught what to think instead of how to think. So I don't think I can blame America. I'm not going to blame America for that. That is becoming a Western issue.
Where did it originate?
It originated from the people that I spoke about when we did our episode on wokeism and wokeness. It originates from the crypto Marxists who are trying to recreate. First of all, they have to destroy the society and then recreate it. That idea that facts, we have to get rid of facts. Do you remember I spoke about? Remember we were talking about critical theory? Do you remember?
Yes.
So in critical theory, you have to first undo what people believe. If people have strong facts at their command and critical thinking ability, they will resist your brainwashing. But if they don't, if they are taught that facts are what they are told, or rather opinions trump facts, then you can brainwash them and make them do what you want.
Yes.
And that
which to me seems like a strategy somebody is actually over many years seems to have employed this as a strategy.
Yes. But
But
yes,
is it
it's
a
not
controlling strategy and people aren't aware that they're being controlled in this way because of all the critical thinking elements have been removed? So
yeah.
people don't critical think, so you're led down a path. I mean, to me, this is how the Soviet system before it was, before Russia
Yes.
used to be.
Yes, you're right. Exactly. Yes. That
It,
was
it,
that and one of the reasons why the USSR fell.
yeah. And this is
It
this
doesn't work.
America's doing the same thing because if you think about it, the Americans themselves, individuals there, they can't even afford the basics like medicine, the food, education, water, housing. You got to pay everything all the time, extortionate prices. And I heard that the average American dies in debt because their debts are unpayable.
Oh,
Yeah,
is it
so
just America? Is it just the citizens' debts that are unpayable?
there's
If
just no
America is now
American debt
over
because
100% of GDP, I mean, America's GDP is what, 21, 22 trillion,
hmm,
but they owe 24 trillion. I mean, the interest, this is an interesting statistic, the interest on America's
debt.
debt, okay, is the equivalent of the income of some middling countries. That's either you can say, well, they must be stinking rich, or you have to say, well, they're stinking poor. Because if your interest is more than the income of some middling countries, that's a huge debt
Mm.
for a country which before Reagan took office didn't even owe anybody anything.
But how's it lost its way? I mean, this
Oh,
is what I don't understand. How's it got this bad where everything is in the situation it's in? You just thought that it'd improve, things would get better, standard of livings would improve, people would have better lifestyles, they would have better education, they would have access to world-class medicine, world-class housing, food, water, live the life of Tony or Riley, as the
live the
case may
life of
be.
Tony. Yay, what a life that is.
But why is it then that they don't? And they don't save money. They don't look after themselves. It's just
Well, the explanation is not something you're going to agree with, and it's Tyler's opinion. I don't think you'll agree with me. In fact, I know you will. But the real explanation is twofold. First of all, the 1971 catastrophic decision to divorce the dollar from the gold standard. That was terrible. That would have put a lid on what you could borrow and what you can do with your money. So it's when they just made it just paper money, it just became paper money. It became toilet paper, basically, at that stage. There's still a lot of
yeah.
confidence in the toilet paper because America is such a huge economy. But that
Mm.
confidence is being increasingly eroded.
I
The
mean,
second reason is, the more pertinent reason is, the emancipation of women. What is the term for giving women the vote? It's not just called emancipation. There's another word for it, isn't it?
mm,
I forget. There's a proper term for it.
you
What the
can't you
fuck is it?
can't use that as the reason.
It is,
Um,
but I'm not using. I'm not. No, it's not use. I firmly believe that giving women the vote is the same thing as shooting your civilization in the head. Anybody,
oh
anywhere. When women get
no.
the vote, it always becomes a more and more welfare state because that women vote
No, but
gifts to
you
themselves.
no,
It's an
this
ongoing
is the
thing.
contrary I'm going to say against what you've
Yeah, I
just
said
said
you weren't
there.
agreeing.
No,
You
I
did say.
totally won't,
Yeah.
because if that's the case, then America should have been going better to a welfare state, but it isn't. It's actually going the other way, and that's why the people who are at the bottom of the rung, the bottom 40% of the population, they're the ones who are suffering because there is no proper welfare state to help look after them in the capacity that it should
Yes,
when
but what do we
they
mean by
need
welfare
propping
state?
up.
What
I
we
mean that there's some help for these people because there's a big minority at the bottom who are disenfranchised, who don't have access to all the things that they need to live a safe, healthy life, to get the education they need, to get the medicines they need, to get the food and housing they need. And disproportionately, it's the Black and Asian community in the US that are suffering because of this discrepancy. and they don't ever want to fix it. They don't. The middle layer are being squeezed as well. And then you've got this tiny little class at the top who are milking everything off of the American system. And that's why you've got so many in that 1% band who are disproportionately wealthy to everybody else. They don't just have to have nots, they have to the have nots. And it's just a silly discrepancy. But we are getting close to the end of the show.
Yes.
We really must have a final summary.
I was going to address that, but somebody here says it's a research paper. Virtually every American will benefit at some point in their lives and will use the nation's social programs. For example, as a child, you might benefit from Medicaid or food stamps. And as a parent, you might take advantage of the child tax credit or the earned income tax credit. There are a lot of things that wouldn't jump out to you unless you knew the American system, but they do spend a heck of a lot of money, and it's gotten worse and worse and worse since when.
So why is it not helping?
Well, now, since we're getting to the end of it, we're going to have to park that for another day. Here's how I would like to summarize. This is from 60 Minutes, the famous American documentary on one of their channels. I think it's NBC. It's the equivalent of our Newsnight program here in the UK. And this is a direct quote. There are a lot of people in the United States right now who think the country is falling apart. And in at least one respect, they are correct. Our roads and bridges are crumbling. Our airports are out of date. The vast majority of our seaports are in danger of becoming obsolete. Now, that was published in 2015 by 60 Minutes. So when I say America is a failed state, what I mean is America is a failed state.
I have to agree with you, but I actually agree with you. So unfortunately, we have to stop there because we have reached the end of the show for another week. If you enjoy listening to our show, why not mention our show to any friends and colleagues you believe would enjoy it too? You, the listeners, can send in your comments and feedback about what we're discussing on our Facebook page, which is www.facebook.com/Tony and Tayo, spelt TonyandTayo. If you leave any comments or questions on the Facebook page, Tayo and I will do our very best to try and answer those questions on a subsequent show or live on air. Remember, you can listen to our show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Alexa, and all good leading audio platforms, as well as on Seclo Radio 105.5 FM. Finally, you can also search for the show on Google by searching for the TNT Talk Show. Ty and I would like to thank you again for tuning in and catch you all next time.